Shalom, sekali lagi selamat pagi, Boker Tov. Rabi sudah bergabung bersama dengan kita, beliau akan segera menyapa dengan kita dan kita akan segera bisa mulai terkait dengan shiur kita sore ini atau pagi ini. Oke, Shalom, Shavuot, good morning Rabi, how are you? You are still on mute, Rabi.
All good, all good.
Yap, baru kasih.
Welcome.
All good.
Welcome to everybody.
Okay, we are also good here. Ya, Bapak Ibu Saudara sekalian, seperti biasa disapa Rabinya.
Morning, Rabbi.
How are you?
Shalom, Rabbi.
Shalom, Rabbi.
To see you all. Very nice. So, Leo, do we have any questions from last time, or are we ready to go ahead?
We do have a question, Rabbi, definitely. Oke, Bapak Ibu Saudara sekalian, apakah ada yang ingin ditanyakan? Silakan, jika ada yang ingin ditanyakan. Kalau ada, segera. Kalau nggak ada, kita bisa lanjut nih. Bagaimana? Apakah ada? Tidak ada? Oke. Rabbi, tidak ada ya? Nggak apa-apa. Mungkin saya coba simulasi dengan pertanyaan yang dari saya. Rabbi, there's one question from yesterday topic because not yesterday, sorry, last week topic. The topic was about conflict and how Noahide laws is basically handle those topic according to the Noahide laws. Okay, so well, the fact that we have to admit everyone for all of us, not every one of us understand and not every one of us aware and even doing the Noahide laws. The ideal situation would be all mankind, all human is using the or understand the Noahide law and do it in their own life. That will be easier because we have a common universal belief, we have a common universal standard, and whatever conflict will be solved based on that. But now we know that not all of them is on that situation. Not all of them are refined that way. For it seems like if there is a conflict in a business, we can it's pretty much quite clear, Rabbi. So we can draw back, right? As long as we can protect our own interests, not being violated by the others, and we can find another a business partner. We can do that. But for maybe in a friendship relation, maybe in a family relation, we know a conflict may arise as well, and our friends, our family, our relatives might not be all aware of the Noahide laws. So what will be the boundaries for us to, for example, say, okay, enough is enough. We don't want to involve further without putting ourselves into the a guilty spot. It will be or a Hilul Hashem. We can say. Yeah, that's maybe the question.
So. Is there a further, somebody wants to add something to that, or is that?
No.
Okay, right. The truth is, of course, we need it's going to work obviously best where there is a common framework. There's no question about that. The question is, however, whether there is some way in which we can, if that framework is not immediately present, is there some way in which we can evoke it? Is there some way in which we can somehow try to create it, or even, I mean, you may not be able to evoke it immediately or in a short term, but can we begin to evoke that common framework? Now, there are different ways to evoke that common framework. In a personal relationship, the thing to do is to try in some way to embark upon a concept of self-transcendence. In other words, how can we bring a people? What enables people to come together is that when they feel similarly, when they are transcending towards the same ideals. So sometimes in a relationship, it may be possible to ask of the other person, or to somehow to stimulate in the other person an element of self-transcendence, whereby they open themselves to Hashem. They open themselves to a transcending level, to a level of they open. In other words, what they do, they begin to expose their own soul. Now, if I may just digress just for a moment, Viktor Frankl, the psychologist, for example, would try to ask people to embark in some way on a process of self-transcendence. In other words, can they rise above their own situation, their own feelings, their own emotions? Can they somehow feel, experience that there is a common God, a common or a higher purpose, something which is greater than their own urges, their own present in feelings, and so on and so forth? Is it possible to stimulate that? Now, for example, supposing I'm talking with a friend who is a very secular person, are there things which I can say to that person which can make that person actually be open to the concept that there is a God? And that are there ways in which I can stimulate in the other person a higher, some openness to a higher principle? When we do this, we are, even if we don't know about the Noahide laws, even if the other person doesn't know about the Noahide laws, the very fact that the person is tuning their own soul onto God, so to speak, means that they will be more receptive to Noahide values. Now, now that's a very hard thing. I don't know if I've explained myself very well, but the idea first, we have to be on the same station. Before we, when you turn a radio, the dial of a radio, for example, if such things exist anymore, I don't know. You turn the dial and it's static. But when you get onto the station, then you begin to hear. You hear clearly. We have to be on the same station. We have to be talking to each other as people in whose souls have been exposed, whose spiritual, that we are exposed the common spirituality which we possess to the one God. And now, even if they don't want to hear those words, even if they don't want to hear that idea, we speak in those terms, and then automatically, to some extent, people then will begin to feel and think in similar ways. Also, there's another way, for example, that if we look at people from different cultures, there is in most cultures, there is at least a residue of monotheism, some residue. There, in other words, there may be some religions which are not purely monotheistic, but at some level there is a monotheism there. At some level, and if one can bring that other person, so to speak, onto the same page, onto the same station, then we're going to be more successful in working out the individual issues. Because all the Noahide laws, they all actually come from the same station. They come from the same source. We imitate God. What does it mean to imitate God? It means to model God. But first of all, you have to know who God is, right? You have to know, we have to be speaking about the same God, the God who is an absolute creator of all of us.
Yeah.
Once we have begun to speak in those terms and to think in those terms and feel in those terms, then I think that there will automatically be a greater agreement on specific issues. It starts with self-transcendence. In other words, let's all get onto the same page. Let's get onto the same station. And that will help. Now, that can be done in an individual relationship. For example, I'm speaking to a person who doesn't believe in God, let us say. Then I can talk in ways which I can stimulate the other person perhaps to be open to the idea of a God, of a creator. If I'm talking to a person who comes from a different culture or a different faith, then we can perhaps tap into levels of experience which we all share, which would open us to that concept of the one God. Once we're talking about the same God, once our souls are open to the same God, then I think automatically our actual concrete issues, the way in which our conduct will become more harmonious. We will tend to agree with the prescriptions of that God. In other words, because God said to me, you want to imitate me? You want to be like me? Then don't steal, don't kill, be moral, respect me, don't treat animals with cruelty. This is what it means to imitate God. So let's first of all try to focus on the same source, and then afterwards, as a secondary result, to some extent, will be a greater openness to the same basic rules and principles which come from that God. Now, I don't know if that. I think that's the way I would do it in a personal relationship, and in other words, to try to get on the same page. And that's the way I would do it on an intercultural level also. In other words, when we speak, if I speak with a person from a different culture, let's see if we can get on the same page. Let's see if we can all relate to the idea of one God, of one principle, of one station. That's a bit of that's a general answer. I mean, if I knew, for example, about the specific question, I'm sure the questioner has got a specific issue in mind. And it's a very difficult one, because I could imagine that in many cases you've probably got marriages where one is a Christian and one is a Noahide. That's probably a very common scenario, I would imagine. But and the page is not necessarily the same. But in that particular case, I would still be probing and trying to say, let's just talk about God. In other words, can we somehow get onto that same page? And then, and that has to be done with certain subtlety. And then I think we can begin to talk about. Just so let's for example, let's suppose you had one person is a believer in abortion, and the other person is not a believer in abortion. Does not think it's right. I'm not talking about the very rare situation where life's in danger. I'm not talking about that situation. The mother's my fault. Well, we can begin to talk about the concept of the sanctity of life, and why is life set? Why would life be holy? Because the human soul, which is also in the fetus, is in the image of God too. Can we relate to that concept? Let's talk about it. Let's see if we can engage at that level in those terms. So it's a question of trying to bring oneself and the other person to that same page, that same principle, and then talking about the rules which follow from that principle. Okay, it's a broad suggestion, even though I realize that I may not have addressed the specific issue of the person.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, let me translate that first, Rabbi. Jadi, Bapak-Ibu sekalian, tadi saya memulai dengan pertanyaan. Kita kan minggu lalu bicara tentang konflik ya, dan bagaimana Noahide laws atau hukum Nuh itu mengatasi konflik. Dan saya bertanya bahwa sebenarnya kalau konflik itu terjadi dengan orang yang sama-sama memahami hukum Nuh, itu kan nggak masalah dan simple gitu kan. Nah sekarang keseringannya terjadi adalah konflik terkait dengan ataupun dialami dengan yang kita memahami hukum Nuh dengan yang tidak memahami hukum Nuh gitu kan. Karena faktanya nggak semua orang saat ini, belum semua orang memahami hukum Nuh dan bagaimana menjalankannya. Nah, kalau seperti itu bagaimana gitu kan? Nah, Rabi berkata bahwa ya justru inilah pentingnya bahwa kita ada selalu di di level yang sama atau di halaman yang sama, atau kita bicara atau frekuensinya, tune-nya tadi Rabi bilang itu ada di frekuensi yang sama antara kita dengan orang-orang yang berkonflik tersebut gitu loh. Nah, mungkin kita bicara, Rabi berkata bahwa ya kita bawa mereka kepada sebuah konsep kesamaan terkait dengan moralitas, terkait dengan Tuhan. Ya kita nggak usah bahas mengenai konsep tentang Tuhan antara kepercayaan yang ini dengan yang itu malah justru membawa pertentangan gitu kan. Tapi yang jelas kita percaya bahwa semua orang pun percaya bahwa Tuhan yang mereka sembah itu kan memberikan konsep moral tertentu gitu. Karena itu aja yang kita bawa mereka ke sana. Yang penting mereka percaya bahwa ada Tuhan dulu kan. Nah, setelah itu baru kita perbaiki. Artinya kita coba berikan bahwa Tuhan yang benar yang di dalam Torah itu mengatakan bahwa konsep moralitas hidup manusia itu adalah seperti ini. Ya kan? Kalau kamu mau menjadi seperti Tuhan, menjadi imitasinya Tuhan, yaitu hidup sesuai dengan Tuhan, itu adalah yaitu tadi jangan membunuh, jangan mencuri, segala macam seperti itu kan. Nah jadi ya itu, jadi senantiasa kita mesti bawa kepada konsep yang umumnya gitu Bapak-Ibu sekalian. Kita bawa kepada konsep yang umum, kita bawa kepada konsep yang sama, kita berusaha ada di hal yang sama dulu gitu kan. Nah bahkan kalau Rabi tadi memberi contoh terkait dengan orang yang tidak percaya orang yang satu percaya aborsi, yang satu tidak mau melakukan aborsi gitu kan. Nah ya bawa juga kepada konsep terkait dengan bahwa hidup itu mulia, bagaimana bahwa hidup itu mulia, bagaimana ada potensi daripada seorang manusia yang akan lahir, yang walaupun saat itu masih dalam bentuk janin, jadi pasti ada sesuatu yang besar yang akan dilahirkan di sana seperti itu. Coba dibawa konsep ke sana. Nah demikian juga tadi Rabi memberikan contoh orang yang misalkan suami istri yang memang kebanyakan kasusnya seperti itu, ya kan, terutama di daerah-daerah di dunia barat, salah satunya satu Kristen, satu lagi Noahide gitu kan, seperti itu kira-kiranya. Ya sama juga dicoba dibawa kepada konsep yang persamaannya. Nah setelah itu baru kita pelan-pelan kita mempelajari dan menggunakan hukum Nuh, atau karena 7 hukum Nuh itu adalah universal gitu. Itu berlaku umum. Kayak misalkan jangan mencuri, semua orang juga pasti nggak mencuri gitu kan. Jangan membunuh, semua orang juga pasti setuju. Nah jadi sebetulnya kita memiliki keuntungan dalam hal ini, Rabi berkata demikian, kita bisa memiliki keuntungan yaitu kita memiliki konsep yang universal, sehingga kita bisa mencoba untuk justru dengan konflik yang kita hadapi, kita bisa mencoba memperkenalkan konsep yang universal ini kepada rekan-rekan kita, kepada siapapun yang kita temui dalam kehidupan sehari-hari. Over to you, Rabbi, for your material.
Okay. Well, so we go now to today's talk, shall we? It flows on from this to some extent.
Sure.
Now, today I would like to speak about a topic which is actually related to this question. It relates to one of the founding documents of the United Nations. Now, the United Nations, there was a basic document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this is a document which was actually put together even before the United Nations was formally established. And this is a very important case in point of how different nations, the question is, how do different nations get onto the same page, or do they fail to get onto the same page? And we see that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is that in many ways it has some good things in it, but it has a number of failures in it. And it doesn't necessarily stand up to the standards of Noahide law. And I want to bring out a number of problems, a critique of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this basic document of the United Nations, from the standpoint of the Noahide laws. What's wrong? What's wrong with it? What's right with it? Well, now, first of all, and this actually will illuminate maybe the very first question you said: how do we get onto the same page? Now, what you had, there was a special commission set up to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this was it was chaired by the wife of an American president, Eleanor Roosevelt. Her husband had died, but he died in his fourth term of office, and she gathered together representatives, people from all over the world, different cultures, from Russia, from China, from South America, from Australia, all over the world. She got together a group of individuals who together would sit down and draft this universal declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, what is very interesting is that the approach which was taken was to try to compile suggestions, if you like, principles put forward from all of these different representatives from different countries. Now, you straight away had a clash between Russia, which was after the Second World War, and its allies in Eastern Europe, and America. One society was, of course, very focused on the state. It was communist. And it wanted very much to assert the rights of the state over the individual, because the communist theory was that the state is there to look after and to provide the needs of the needs of the individual, to give the individual work, to give the individual social security, etc. The Americans, on the other hand, what did they come with? They came with actually a very different perspective. The American perspective was to assert the rights of the individual against the state, and that was a traditional American approach. Then what you had coming from China. Now, in that stage, the person who there had not yet occurred the communist revolution in China. So you had a representative who was essentially from what was called the Kuomintang. That is the group which now is Taiwan, right? It was essentially defeated on mainland China later on, but he was coming from a Confucian background. Then you had people from the Muslim world, and you had you had some from Latin America as well, but of course they were from India, and I don't know if Indonesia or not. I'm not sure about that. I don't know if there were representatives from Indonesia. I don't know. Now, the problem here was that from the very outset, they had no common culture. They had no common perspective. And very often what they were doing was that they were reflecting the particular political attitudes of these different societies. So, for example, the Russians said, everybody has a right to work. Well, okay, that's something which a communist society can do, because it runs the economy. It can give everybody a job, but it can tell people what job to do. In other words, and it takes away the freedom of people in many ways to engage in their own activity. The Americans, as I mentioned before, they were there the Americans were there to because they had the experience of Nazism. and fascism, they wanted to make sure the state will never gain superior, it will never become a force which can take away the liberties of the individual. But what you had here was that one thing was missing. One thing was completely missing from the gathering which got there, which came together, and that was they could not come onto a basic agreement on ultimate principles, and they didn't even attempt to do that. Now, the question would be, and maybe that was partly a result of that reflected, if you like, the conflicts which existed in the world at that time. But we have to ask ourselves now, that obviously without being on the same page, it was in some ways doomed to failure. And in fact, what happened was that the Russians, after all, when it came to vote on it, they abstained. They didn't even endorse. They did not even endorse the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, number one, the first question would be, and maybe it would have been historically difficult to do it. It was just post-war. A whole host of conflicts were going on. The question we have now, here's the question: is it possible? Would it now be possible for a new document to be made in which everybody could invoke a common principle? Now, what do we see? For example, here's an example. For example, now look at Russia today. Russia today is not communist. Russia, as a matter of fact, there were some recent amendments to the Russian constitution. And one of those amendments states that the Russian people believe in God. That nothing could be more different to communism. Now, the question is, would it be possible to get a similar statement from all the nations of the world today, or the major nations? So you might say straight away, well, what about communist China? Communist China is it's a communist, it's a materialist, atheistic setup. But one of the, and this is for me is a very important question. I think it's one thing is that the leader of China today says that he acknowledges the Confucian background of China. Now, Confucianism was not a very spiritual religion, but it did recognize heaven. It talked about heaven. So would it be possible today to get the different, Russia would certainly say, yeah, that it believes in God. It might be the only country in the world which does. I don't know, but I mean, apart from Israel, but others. But I mean, Indonesia will surely say that too, because it's Indonesia there. But the Islamic countries, why were they seeking here a liberal democratic system, a set of principles, instead of appealing to a more fundamental one? Why didn't the Americans themselves try to bring God into the Declaration of Universal Rights? So that's question number one. Is we look and we see that the United Nations from the very outset, it had no common foundation. It was incorporate from the beginning. You saw the conflicts of individual cultures in the principles which they tried to compile together, but there was no common statement. So the number one question is, and this takes the very first question we had onto an international scale. Is it possible? Can we from amongst the nations of the world agree as a first principle that there is a creator, that there is a God? Because much will flow from this. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not even attempt to do it. And that was a major problem. Maybe it was hard. Maybe it would have been very difficult at that time. Yeah. But the question is now, we have to ask ourselves, would it be possible to get a consensus amongst the nations of the world that there is, call it heaven, a supreme principle, a higher principle, call it what you like? Could we do that? Because if we could do that, then we would have everybody on the same page, everybody on the same station. And that would be a start for getting genuinely universal principles. Well, I'll let you translate that a little bit first.
Oke. Baik, jadi Bapak Ibu sekalian kita akan masuk kepada praktek ataupun juga penjelasan praktis kedua, dan kali ini memang cukup berat karena ini terkait dengan dunia internasional. Cuman memang ini bisa kita pelajari, dan tentunya ya gimana pun juga tujuan daripada alam semesta ini dan juga kehidupan ini adalah membawa seluruh alam semesta, seluruh umat manusia kepada satu kesatuan, yaitu kan kepada pemahaman yang benar akan Tuhan sebagaimana dinubuatkan oleh kitab Zakaria dan para nabi tentunya. Oke. Nah, kali ini Rabi akan menjelaskan atau membahas terkait dengan apa yang sudah dilakukan oleh Persatuan Bangsa-Bangsa, United Nation, ya. Dan ini adalah sebuah kritik dan juga sebuah koreksi dari sudut pandang Noahide ataupun juga hukum Nuh, 7 hukum Nuh, terkait dengan apa yang sudah diproduksi dan apa yang sudah berjalan di dalam PBB, di dalam sebuah organisasi yang namanya PBB, gitu ya. Nah, satu hal yang akan dibahas kali ini adalah terkait dengan deklarasi universal terhadap hak-hak manusia. Ya, hak asasi manusia. Nah, ini kan sangat ini banget gitu ya, sangat sangat diagungkan banget gitu kan. Nah, yang perlu dipahami adalah secara sejarahnya bahwa deklarasi universal terhadap hak asasi manusia ini adalah menjadi sebuah dasar yang mana PBB itu beroperasi. Dan ini deklarasi ini itu bahkan dibentuk ataupun terjadi sebelum PBB itu sendiri terwujud gitu secara organisasi gitu ya. Nah, pada waktu itu yang terjadi adalah ada sebuah kayak komisi spesial, komisi khusus gitu, yang terdiri dari berbagai macam bangsa, ada yang dari Afrika, ada dari Rusia, dari Eropa, dari Amerika, dari Cina, segala macam. Nah, Rabi juga nggak ngerti apakah Indonesia termasuk atau tidak, harus dipelajari lebih lanjut. Nah, tapi yang jelas ini boleh dikatakan itu mengumpulkan dari segala macam manusia di seluruh dunia, perwakilannya tentunya ya, dan ini diprakarsai oleh Eleanor Roosevelt, ibu negara Amerika pada waktu itu ya. Nah approach ataupun pola pendekatan yang dilakukan saat itu adalah hanya mengumpulkan saran-saran, pendapat-pendapat. Menurut kamu seperti apa? Menurut negara ini seperti apa? Hak asasi manusia itu seperti apa? Gitu-gituan kan? Nah, tentunya di sini langsung begitu mengeluarkan pendapat saja itu pasti sudah langsung terjadi konflik ya. Yang paling kelihatan konfliknya adalah antara Rusia atau Uni Soviet gitu saat itu ya dengan Amerika, karena Amerika dan juga negara-negara Barat yang waktu itu sudah baru saja selesai dari masa-masa tirani gitu ya, masa-masa diktator ya, ada Nazi di situ, ada macam-macam di situ, kekerasan-kekerasan yang terjadi, Perang Dunia Pertama, Perang Dunia Kedua. Nah, makanya boleh dikatakan perwakilan daripada orang-orang budaya Barat, Eropa ataupun Amerika itu berusaha untuk mencegah bagaimana negara itu atau state itu memiliki kontrol yang terlalu berlebihan sehingga mengekang kebebasan umat manusia. Ya, kebebasan individu. Nah, maka dari itu yang diperjuangkan oleh blok Barat, kalau kita boleh bilang seperti itu istilahnya, itu adalah memperjuangkan hak asasi manusia secara individu, tidak boleh diprotek gitu kan. Bahkan bila mana ada hak asasi individu yang sepertinya bertentangan dengan kebijakan negara, ya harus dihargai juga. Kita tahu kan blok Barat kan seperti itu. Nah, di sisi lain boleh dikatakan yang blok Timur gitu kan, yang dimotori oleh Uni Soviet, Rusia dan Cina dan yang sejenisnya, karena mereka berdasarkan komunis, mereka peduli percaya bahwa negara atau state itu harus memegang peranan penting, harus mengatur rakyatnya, rakyat nggak boleh macam-macam, ya kan, karena ekonomi itu digerakkan oleh rakyat, maka pemerintah yang harus mengatur biar ada keharmonisan di situ. Nah, tapi kita juga tahu bahwa mereka juga kadang-kadang bisa melebihi batas sampai dengan ada hak individu itu juga akhirnya terampas begitu kan. Nah, kalau mereka pemahamannya adalah selama negaranya mengambil kontrol ya nggak masalah. Nah, ini kan selalu clash. Nah, belum lagi dari negara-negara lain. Ada yang dari Muslim pandangannya berbeda, ada yang dari negara lain lagi, dari Taiwan juga datang waktu itu, dan juga ini juga bingung juga kata Rabbi pada saat itu. Nah, akhirnya di situ adalah walaupun ada deklarasi human rights gitu ya, walaupun ada sebuah deklarasi Universal Declaration of Human Rights, itu ada yang kurang di situ, yaitu adalah ada yang hilang, yaitu adalah komponen kesamaan platform atau kesamaan daripada konsep yang menjadi konsep dasar. Yang sebetulnya adalah di situ yang menjadi konsep dasarnya adalah pengakuan terhadap adanya Sang Pencipta manusia. Itu yang kurang. Acknowledgement of the creator itu yang kurang di situ, Bapak Ibu sekalian. Nah, sehingga itulah yang akhirnya masing-masing ya menurut saya begini, memperlakukan manusia itu ya menurut saya begini, memperlakukan hak asasi manusia itu menurut negara yang satu lagi itu begini, bukan seperti kamu seperti itu gitu loh. Jadi ini masing-masing punya itu sendiri. Nah, justru deklarasi human rights ini bahkan tidak berusaha untuk memasukkan common platform itu, kesamaan platform itu di situ. Mereka cuma sekedar menurut ini begini, ya udah deh. Nah, makanya kita lihat sekarang walaupun ada yang namanya sebuah organisasi yang cukup bagus dan cukup mulia tujuannya yang namanya PBB, United Nations, konflik tetap terjadi di mana-mana, ya kan? Kita bisa lihat. Yaitu tadi karena ya sebetulnya cuma sekedar menampung saja, menurut kamu begini, menurut negara ini begini, menurut negara itu begitu. Oke? Nah, sekarang pertanyaannya adalah apakah mungkin untuk memasukkan kesamaan platform tersebut terhadap deklarasi terhadap hak asasi manusia. Mungkin di amandemen lah gitu loh. Nah, mungkin kita berkata bahwa sebetulnya nggak mungkin. Atau mungkin kita berkata, belum mungkin. Tapi ada beberapa fakta yang dikemukakan oleh Rabbi Cowen tadi berkata bahwa negara Rusia saja sekarang, yang tadinya kita tahu bahwa itu adalah bekas Uni Soviet, dan itu dalam boleh dikatakan lokomotif daripada Uni Soviet, gitu kan, gembongnya gitu kan, dan komunisme itu lahir di sana. Mereka sudah meratifikasi dan mereka sudah melakukan amandemen terhadap dasar-dasar negaranya, dan satu yang mereka tempatkan di situ adalah mereka percaya kepada akan adanya Tuhan. Luar biasa ya, dari sebuah negara Uni Soviet yang komunisme dan mereka menolak Tuhan karena mereka yang sangat-sangat materialistik gitu kan, mereka nggak percaya dengan Tuhan. Sekarang dengan mereka berubah negaranya menjadi Rusia, ya, dan yang lain-lainnya itu merdeka masing-masing. Rusianya ini yang besarnya ini berkata bahwa kita percaya kepada adanya Tuhan. Itu satu, ya. Lalu bagaimana dengan Cina? Cina kan sekarang komunis, yang satu-satunya mungkin negara komunis yang ada di dunia.
Suaranya hilang,
Halo, bagaimana sekarang? Apakah ada?
Oke.
Sure. Sampai mana tadi? Rusia atau Cina?
Rusia.
Cina.
Oke. Nah, sekarang Cina itu setelah Rusia itu kan yang komunis berikutnya adalah Cina, gitu kan? Nah, Cina itu sekarang mungkin kita berkata bahwa dia yang benar-benar komunis. Susah juga nih bagaimana caranya gitu kan. Nah, ternyata Cina itu juga, pemimpin Cina sekarang ini itu mengakui bahwa memang Cina itu memiliki latar belakang Konfusionisme, ya, Konghucu gitu kan, yang sekarang itu kalau dalam bahasa Indonesia itu adalah Konghucu. Nah, memang mungkin Konghucu juga tidak terlalu tidak terlalu spiritual. Konghucu itu juga sebetulnya cukup materialis juga, tapi Konghucu ini juga mengakui adanya surga, ada konsep surga di sana. Nah, makanya Rabbi berkata bahwa sebetulnya di dalam budaya ataupun di dalam hal apapun, adat istiadat dari seluruh umat manusia itu ada residu, ada jejak-jejak peninggalan-peninggalan terhadap monoteisme. Konsep Tuhan yang benar itu ada jejaknya. Nah, sekarang tinggal diaktifkan saja gitu kan. Nah, jadi sebetulnya dunia ini tanpa kita sadari, ya kan, mungkin yang kita lihat di luarnya itu adalah sesuatu yang beragam dan mungkin sulit untuk dipersatukan, tetapi di sini kita bisa lihat dari pemahaman yang diberikan oleh Rabbi bahwa dunia ini menuju kepada satu kesatuan, dan mulai dunia-dunia yang tadinya nggak percaya kepada Tuhan, bagian-bagian dunia yang tadinya nggak percaya kepada Tuhan, mulai kembali kepada konsep oh iya ya, ada surga, ada pencipta, dan ada Tuhan di situ. Oke? Itu yang tadi kita dibahas oleh Rabbi. Over to you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Now, the next thing is when we look at actually the rights which the Universal Declaration contains, they are not necessarily universal rights. Now, what is a right? What is a right? Now, a right is something which is based on an acceptable principle. For example, today, now this is not included in the Universal Declaration. But if somebody today says that there is a right for every person to have an abortion, abortion is a right, there is no such right, because only in the case of danger to life do we permit such a thing. The notion that there is an abstract right to have an abortion, any woman can have an abortion if she wants, under any circumstances, such a right does not exist, because it's inconsistent with Noahide laws. The only rights that we can posit, which we can put forward, are rights which can be derived from Noahide law. So the fact that people use the word rights, this right, that right's another right, it's meaningless if it can't be inferred, if it can't be deduced from Noahide law. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not talk about abortion. But, for example, it did, and this was probably under the influence of the Russian communist representative, it said that there is a right to work. Now, that also is not actually true, according to Noahide law. Of course, we want every human being should have a living, should have food and money, and should have what they need. But where do the concept of a right to work, that is something which a communist regime can accomplish, because a communist regime can make sure that every individual is working, but working at what the state wants them to work at. In other words, so this is an example. There is no such thing in Noahide law as a right to work. There is an obligation of us to help another person, and if a person is hungry, to feed them, or if a person is poor, to give them charity and to help. And that's in fact what very often the state does. It gives social security to people who don't have employment. But the idea that there is a right to work, that is not true. That is not strictly true. It's only the communists thought it's true, and the communists was within the power of the communist state to make sure that everybody worked, but to do the work that the state wanted them to do. Now, then there is and then there are other rights which were set up here. They spoke about a right to life. Now, of course, a right to life, that's good, but it didn't talk. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not talk about an obligation to protect life. It didn't say who has the right to life and what has the right to life. It didn't talk about a fetus, for example. It didn't talk. There's another case where a person, let's say the pursuer, if a person is being pursued by another person, it didn't say there that we are obligated to protect the life of the pursued individual. So, in other words, the concepts which are being drawn, there are abstract statements here, but they are not statements which are adequate, or they're not always necessarily required by Noahide law, but they're set forth nevertheless as universal rights. So there are 2 points which I want to make here. One point is this. Is that you cannot posit a right which cannot be deduced from Noahide law. And for example, those like the people who say these days there's a right to abortion. There's no right to abortion. There can be an abortion in the case of a danger to a mother, but there's no abstract right to abortion. Similarly, there is then there are a whole group of provisions in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which talk about which talk about conditions which are not applicable today. For example, it says that everybody, it says that everybody, that under all circumstances, justice must always be a public hearing. Now, that is not necessarily always true. Sometimes, for example, there can be a military court. A military court has to make forms together to judge a particular breach of security which occurred. And it may be that for various reasons of national security, that court cannot be public. It has to be impartial, but it cannot always be public. Similarly, it says here that they set up here also the right of a person to return to his country. Now, that is not necessarily always true, because if a person is a terrorist, for example, and that terrorist says, that terrorist has been hosted by another country, and that terrorist now claims a right to return to his country, well, it may be that the country from which he's come will refuse that right because this person is a terrorist. You see, the point I'm making over here is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights contained a number of provisions which were based on the experience of the war. And they saw how people had been expelled from nations, and they saw this, and they set up means to prevent this. But these laws did not possess true universality. And so basically what we're saying here is two things. One, it's here again, they made specific rules which do not apply under all circumstances. That's number one. Secondly, there is a problem here that over and over again, we saw that they were, instead of finding those principles which are genuinely universal, and the Noahide laws are universal. For example, the Noahide laws do not tell us what kind of system of government you have to have. It doesn't say that an economy, for example, must be a free market economy. It doesn't say that an economy, or that an economy, for example, cannot be a more regulated economy. What it says is that there are laws of there are laws of economic justice. There are laws relating to economic activity, but that permits a variety of actual systems. Now, what happened in this Universal Declaration was that you found this tremendous clash between America and Russia playing out in the principles that they were setting up. And these principles are not universal; they are particular to different systems of government. So, basically, to summarize this point, there is no universal right which cannot be, unless it can be deduced from Noahide law. That's number one. Number two is, it's important to realize that the rights and obligations which are set forth should be ones which are universal, let us say Noahide, not specific to particular cultures or specific to particular sets, forms of government or forms of economy. That's not what the Noahide laws come in. The Noahide laws say how a free market, if it's a free market, or if it's a more regulated market, that's not the comment of the Noahide. The Noahide laws set up basic rules of behavior within any economic system. That's the main point over here. So to summarize, there is when the United Nations this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by incorporating specific cultural phenomena, cultural rules of different societies, it in fact created conditions of conflict. It didn't create universality. And that's why Russia, in the end, wouldn't endorse it after putting in all of its requirements. And because it hadn't taken the truly universal principles which govern any culture, any economic system, any government. And when it did set up, so that sometimes it erred on specificity. And when it's tried to set up general principles, it also didn't get those general principles correct. It didn't have a foundation. It couldn't. I mean, there are principles there which Noahide laws would affirm, but it was not deducing its principles from the Noahide code, from a general code, a code which applies to all cultures. I don't know if I've explained that very well, but see what you can do with it.
Sure, Rabbi. That's understandable, certainly. Oke, Bapak Ibu sekalian. Jadi sekarang berikutnya adalah terkait dengan hak asasi. Ini kan kita tadi ngomongin terkait dengan sejarah dan tadi Rabbi menilai berdasarkan point of view daripada 7 hukum Nuh, daripada TAURAT, itu apa yang kurang daripada deklarasi daripada terhadap hak asasi manusia itu kan. Nah, sekarang kita belajar atau kita membahas tentang hak asasi itu sendiri. Apa sih yang disebutkan dengan hak asasi itu? Nah, Rabbi mendefinisikan bahwa hak asasi itu adalah sesuatu ketetapan yang berdasarkan terhadap prinsip yang universal, yang bisa diterima dan bisa diakui oleh semua manusia, baik itu suku apapun, budaya apapun, mereka setuju dan sepakat, oh iya ini memang harus ditaati gitu kan, ini sesuatu yang memang berlaku bagi kami juga. Nah, itulah sebetulnya hak asasi manusia. Nah, sekarang kalau kita lihat, kita tengok di dalam hak asasi yang ada gitu kan, itu banyak sekali di dalam deklarasi daripada hak asasi manusia yang universal yang versinya PBB itu banyak sekali dari antara merekanya itu yang ternyata adalah sebetulnya tidak bisa dijalankan oleh semua orang gitu ya. Artinya ini spesifik terhadap itu tertentu saja gitu kan. Contohnya aborsi, itu ada yang diizinkan, tapi ternyata ya nggak semua orang juga setuju kan, dan tidak semua budaya juga setuju. Contohnya juga di Indonesia kita nggak setuju dengan aborsi, jelas gitu kan. Bahkan pemerintah kita juga nggak setuju dengan yang namanya aborsi. Bahkan itu aborsi adalah sebuah tindakan pidana. Nah, tetapi di Barat, mereka senang sekali gitu kan, karena mereka punya pemikiran yang berbeda, konsep yang berbeda. Nah, Rabbi juga menjelaskan terkait dengan right ataupun juga hak asasi terhadap pekerjaan. Nah, ini sebetulnya agak abu-abu juga, karena sebetulnya di dalam hukum Nuh itu nggak ada hak untuk bekerja. Yang ada adalah hak di mana kita yang ada adalah aturan untuk bagaimana kita memperhatikan yang lemah, memperhatikan yang kurang beruntung, kita membantu dengan segala macam yang kita punya gitu kan. Jadi dari mana ini tiba-tiba ada hak untuk bekerja, itu adalah dari konsep komunisme sebetulnya, karena mereka mau berkata bahwa pekerjaan itu biar tidak menjadi beban gitu kan, itu makanya harus menjadi sebuah hak daripada masyarakat gitu, mereka harus bekerja seperti itu. Nah, itu konsepnya mereka seperti itu. Lalu juga hak untuk hidup, memang di sini hak untuk hidup itu ada dituliskan di dalam deklarasinya gitu kan. Nah, tetapi sebetulnya tidak memberikan penjelasan yang lebih rinci gitu. Jadi seperti hak seperti apa? Apakah bayi dalam kandungan memiliki hak tersebut? Lalu bagaimana jika misalkan jika nyawa kita terancam atau nyawa kita terancam akan ada orang yang ingin membunuh kita, bolehkah kita membela diri apa segala macam? Nah, sekarang di negara kita aja bahkan mungkin sering terjadi kebingungan begitu kan, bila mana ada orang yang karena mempertahankan diri akhirnya malah terjadi pembunuhan, justru yang apapun yang terjadi gitu kan, yang menghilangkan nyawa orang tersebutlah yang akhirnya dihukum. Ya kan, padahal sebetulnya menghilangkan nyawa orang dalam konteks untuk mempertahankan diri. Bila mana dia tidak dikejar, bila mana dia tidak akan dibunuh, ya dia nggak akan mungkin seperti itu, ya kan? Nah, jadi di sini aja masih terdapat kebingungan dan banyak hal yang sepertinya kok malah menjadi menimbulkan sesuatu yang kurang baik juga gitu kan. Nah, maka dari itu Rabbi menyarankan bahwa sebuah definisi daripada hak itu adalah sesuatu yang bersifat universal, diterima oleh semua pihak, dan yang lebih baik lagi adalah jika memang itu merupakan produk turunan daripada 7 hukum Nuh. Karena 7 hukum Nuh itu bersifat universal, pasti diterima oleh semua orang gitu kan. Nah, makanya itulah yang kurang, atau ya karena ini juga merupakan sebuah kritik dari Rabbi terhadap deklarasi PBB tersebut, ya inilah yang kurang gitu kan. Ya, nah contoh juga lagi tadi hak untuk kembali kepada negaranya. Itu juga pusing juga gitu kan. Bila mana orang tersebut meninggalkan negaranya karena keinginan sendiri lalu menjadi teroris, balik lagi gimana? Ya kan, apakah dia nanti akhirnya menjadi teroris juga di negaranya? Nah, ini kan sesuatu yang abu-abu, dan ini kita juga mengalaminya by the way gitu kan. Nah, jadi maka dari itu boleh dikatakan bahwa yang ada di dalam deklarasi PBB tersebut itu adalah aturan-aturan yang tidak bisa bekerja di dalam setiap keadaan gitu kan. Jadi ini benar-benar boleh dikatakan hanya bisa cukup banyak rules-nya itu ataupun aturan-aturannya hanya berlaku untuk kondisi-kondisi tertentu saja. Nah, itu sebetulnya tidak bisa disebut sebagai universal, ya. Oke. Nah, di kontras yang lain, hukum Nuh itu atau Noahide laws itu tidak akan pernah mendikte terkait dengan jenis pemerintahan seperti apa. Nggak pernah mendikte. Tapi yang jelas yang diatur adalah harus ada keadilan. Ya kan, karena itu yang ditentukan. Sistem ekonomi juga tidak didikte harus sistem ekonomi yang begini yang begitu, nggak ada. Tetapi yang jelas harus bebas, harus adil, semua orang memiliki kesempatan yang sama, dan harus diatur di dalamnya bahwa semua yang terjadi di dalam aktivitas ekonomi itu adalah sesuai dengan hukum Nuh. Itu aja gitu loh. Mau si konsepnya terbuka, tertutup, apa segala macam terserah, tapi yang jelas harus ada keadilan. Nah, karena inilah sebetulnya 7 hukum itu adalah hal-hal yang mengatur terkait dengan perilaku dasar daripada seluruh umat manusia, seluruh individu, seluruh manusia. Demikian. Over to you, Rabbi.
Well, I think we have to stop now. I'm sorry,
yeah.
But I hope that was. Thank you for your efforts in the translation. It's a big topic. It's a very important topic. But at all events, as I say, if anybody got questions, I'm very happy to hear the question at the beginning of next week's session. Okay.
No problem,
right.
Rabbi.
Thank you all, and all the very
so
pleasure.
much. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you for your time. Shalom.
Okay. Thank you.
Baik.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. See you.
Bapak Ibu Saudara sekalian, Rabbi sudah meninggalkan kita. Bila mana ada pertanyaan yang ingin ditanyakan oleh Bapak Ibu Saudara sekalian terkait dengan Shiur tadi, boleh ditanyakan dan disimpan, dan nanti kita utarakan kepada Rabbi minggu depan, ya. Dan bagi member anggota Komunitas Bnei Noah Indonesia, kita akan bertemu nanti malam. Kita akan bahas lebih lagi terkait dengan kitab Berachot. Kita berjalan lebih lagi, dan kita akan selesaikan narasi penciptaan sampai dengan hari ke-7. Kita kemarin sudah sampai di hari ke-3, kita sekarang akan selesaikan sampai dengan hari ke-7. Akan ada sesuatu yang luar biasa yang akan kita pelajari bersama, dan saya yakin ini akan berguna bagi kehidupan kita semua. Oke, baik, kita cukupkan sampai di sini. Kita ketemu lagi nanti malam. Baik, shalom. Selamat melanjutkan kehidupan. Shalom. Bukan